New year, new me! Forget it. At Ladies We Need to Talk, we're keeping it real. We're calling out wellness industry nonsense, Ozempic and its influence, and how our relentless striving for perfection is actually bad for us. So join us for the anti-New Year's resolution and start 2026 on the right foot. Search Ladies We Need to Talk on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that in this episode we're going to be discussing an Aboriginal person who has died. It's been 6 months since the coroner made the explosive finding that racism was a contributor to Kumanjayi Walker's death and recommended significant reforms to try and change the culture in the NT police force. We'll dig into whether anything has changed and answer your questions. I'm Stephen Stockwell. This is Chapter 6 of the case of Kumanjayi Walker.
Constable Zachary Rolfe fatally shot the 19-year-old.
Sometimes I think about how he must have felt in his last moments. Was he scared?
And I can promise you, consequences will flow.
Constable Rolfe has pleaded not guilty to one charge of murder.
Prosecutors took the case to the High Court.
There's been a huge outpouring of grief.
An organisation with significant hallmarks of institutional racism.
When we are going to get justice? When?
Throughout this series, looking at the shooting of Kumanjayi Walker, we have had so many questions and reflections from all of you, as well as our own. So we're going to answer some of them and find out whether anything is changing when it comes to policing and governing in the Northern Territory. To help us, as always, with this in this series is ABC reporter and presenter Melissa Mackay. Welcome, Melissa.
Hey, Stocky.
Mel, we are now 6 months on from the handing down of this inquest report. Where are we at?
Well, a lot has changed in the last 6 months. The Northern Territory Police Force has finally got a full-time permanent police commissioner now. Martin Dole had been acting in the role when these findings were handed down. He has now been made the Commissioner of Police. The NT Police Force has also released its anti-racism strategy, which was a really big recommendation by the coroner in relation to Kumanjayi Walker's death. Okay,
so, I mean, it sounds like there is a little bit of progress happening. There are things changing, which is, you know, maybe I'm a bit cynical, but it's maybe a little bit more than I was expecting. Has it all been kind of smooth sailing though?
I mean, there's certainly been, you know, this appetite for change within the upper echelons of the Northern Territory Police Force, but we haven't yet seen a formal response from the Northern Territory government yet. They haven't legally had to provide a formal response just yet. They've got, you know, under the legislation, a certain amount of time to be able to do that, and so we are expecting that to come in the next few months when Parliament returns for the year. But so far, when, you know, the Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro, has been asked about it, you know, the response has largely rested on the cost of this inquest and how long it took to get to this point. There hasn't been this formal recognition yet from the Northern Territory government about this systemic racism that the coroner found within the police force. In fact, I saw a press conference with the Chief Minister not long ago where she was asked about the anti-racism strategy and the racism in the NT police force, and she sort of rejected the premise of that question.
Right. I mean, that's really interesting because, as you say, the NT police force has been moving forward. I mean, we talked in our last episode about how they'd already started doing some of this work before the findings were handed down. You know, they were hearing what was being, you know, told to the coroner, Elizabeth Armitage, and they were making actions throughout that process. And one of them, I believe, was the appointment of Leanne Little, an Arundel woman, to come in and draft an anti-racism framework for the NT police. Is that all kind of moving ahead going forward?
Yeah, it is. Leanne Little has released this anti-racism strategy alongside the police commissioner, Martin Dole, made up of 4 key priority areas, including eliminating racism and representing and reflecting the Northern Territory, as well as calling for police officers to be more accountable. So part of it is rolling out anti-racism training to police, giving them ways to identify racism, improving processes as well that protect whistleblowers and victims of racism, which is something that was highlighted throughout this inquest. They also are looking to boost Aboriginal employment to 30% across the police force.
And this is what Leanne Little, who is the head of cultural reform at the NT Police, told our Darwin ABC colleague Eleni Roussos during an exclusive interview in November last year when she talked about her experience in that role.
I can honestly say now that I've seen behaviour shift dramatically, and that's due to the leadership in the police force. I've had police officers who have been gifted or taken artefacts from communities that might be 10, 15 years ago, return those items to me because they know that they wasn't theirs to take. I've seen lots of complaints over my table that I'm now looking at and passing on to other parties to deal with.
But that's also not to say that every police officer in the Northern Territory, recognises these findings and recommendations. As we've been talking about throughout this series, there was that sort of binary view, right? People who were either pro Zachary Rolfe or pro Kumanjayi Walker and his community, right? There was this sort of this binary that developed quite quickly. And I think there are still, elements of the police force that may not feel as though there is a problem or may not feel as though there is as much of a problem as the coroner has made out to be in her findings and recommendations. But from what we've heard from the Commissioner, from Leanne Little, there isn't really an option to not make any of these changes.
Well, the risk is too high. We know that when racism is there, that it contributes to suicide, it contributes to hurt and harm. We know it contributes to antisocial behaviour, to alcohol and drug use, to contact with the criminal justice system. We know that it hurts and harms people in ways where it's not their responsibility to own that poor behaviour by those officers. So at the end of the day, this is a risk that we have to take and we can't fail.
That's Leanne Little, an Aranda woman who is basically the anti-racism framework architect within the Northern Territory Police. And in this episode, we're going to talk through, some of the changes that we've seen since the findings were handed down. We're going to explore the fallout and also answer your questions that have been sent through to the caseof at abc.net.au. We've had so many questions sent through and also some really beautiful and thoughtful reflections as well. So we'll get to them throughout this episode. Mel, what I want to start with, though, was actually a suggestion that was sent through to the inbox. Someone asking if we could give the context of the name Kumanjayi. Why is that a name we hear used for different Aboriginal people?
Kumanjayi is a name used after someone has passed away in Warlpiri culture. So there are different substitute names for different cultures, but within Kumanjayi Walker's family and his community, Kumanjayi is sort of this substitute name that is given to someone after they've passed away. They don't speak his first name anymore now that he has died. And so we use Kumanjayi for Kumanjayi Walker in this context, but it's also a name given to many other Warlpiri people who have passed away. We use Kumanjayi and then their surname.
Yeah. Thank you, Mel. You might notice at the start of these episodes, we have a warning mentioning we're going to be talking about the name or mentioning the name of an Aboriginal person who has died. And really, we're doing that so people listening know that we're going to be discussing Kumanjayi Walker in these episodes, even though we're not using his first name. Not a question from Julie, Mel, but a statement that she has sent in. Julie writes that, she spent the last 6 years living and working across 18 remote communities, mostly in the Northern Territory, but also in South Australia and Western Australia. And this included Yuendumu, which she left just 1 week before the shooting occurred. She says, from that experience, I genuinely believe Northern Territory Police have one of the hardest jobs in Australia. They operate with minimal support, stations are consistently undermanned, and officers are often working in extremely complex, high-pressure environments. In one community I worked in, an 8-person station rarely had more than 2 or 3 officers physically in the community at any time. Coming from South Australia originally, I had absolutely no idea that parts of Australia function like this. The culture shock is real and confronting. I honestly believe that every Australian should spend at least a month living in a remote community. There are roles for everyone, from professionals to shop assistants, and the experience gives a depth of understanding you simply can't get from the outside. Do yourself a favour, see it for yourself, and make lifelong memories and friendships. Mel, you spent time in Yuendumu, you spent time in remote communities. I mean, does that outline from Julie kind of ring true?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I think Julie is absolutely right in saying that, the culture shock is real, and she, like many other Australians, wouldn't have had any idea that parts of Australia function like this, as she said. I think we talked about this in an earlier episode around, the difficulty of police officers' work in remote communities. And I think we heard about it a lot, particularly in the lead up to Kumanjayi Walker's death, that the police officers who were working in Yuendumu at the time were overworked. They were exhausted. The coroner had a lot of really good things to say about the work of police in remote communities, and, that they do have a really, really tough job. Yuendumu, for example, is 300 kilometres from Alice Springs, and anyone who's been to Alice Springs would know that even Alice Springs is really, really remote from anywhere else in the country. It's several hours on a plane to get anywhere from Alice. And so remote communities spattered across the Northern Territory, WA, South Australia, Queensland, they are really remote and really different to what anyone who, has grown up in somewhere like Sydney would understand.
Yeah, Mel, I mean, I've been fortunate in my work to travel through so many parts of Australia. I worked in Karratha for a couple of years. I've travelled across, northern WA, the Northern Territory, all through Queensland as well. And the places are incredibly beautiful. The people are wonderful, but, they're not without their challenges. You see some really confronting living conditions for people. You see some really confronting interactions between white people and Aboriginal people in those places as well. And so there's a lot to unpack when you go to those places, but it's a reality of parts of Australia, right? And I mean, Mel, one of the recommendations we saw from the coroner was that Northern Territory Police should spend time in those communities, that they should spend at least a couple of years at the start of their career working in remote communities in places around the Northern Territory so they have an understanding of what it's like.
Yeah, absolutely. This was something that was really important for the coroner to make a point about in terms of police having an understanding of what it's like policing in a remote community by comparison to somewhere like Darwin or Alice Springs. The challenges that community members face in a remote community is very different to the challenges that you face living in Darwin, and the challenges as a police officer are very different to what you face in a bigger community. And so in having that experience of, working in a remote community, I think the coroner sort of talked about people needing to have a cultural understanding of the places that they're working in order to try and tackle these unconscious biases and racism that can develop, as she said. Leanne Little has done a lot of work in that space, and she has also acknowledged the difficulty of working in remote communities.
Yeah, and Mel, I mean, as well as police getting that experience, it was a finding of the NT coroner that there's elements of the NT police that are racist. There's racism that exists within that organisation. And, it sounds like Leanne Little, who we heard from a little bit earlier, is working quite hard to not just address that, but also address the idea that all police are racist.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this is something that she is working to try and build a space where police officers also feel comfortable in reporting, racism that they see. The coroner found even, for example, when those racist awards that we heard so much about throughout the inquest were being handed out by the TRG, when that came to light so many years after they had been happening, that there were so many members of the police force who knew that was happening and didn't say anything. That's something that the coroner found was evidence of this entrenched systemic racism within the Northern Territory Police Force that people like Leanne Little are now trying to grapple with how to change that culture.
Yeah, and this is what Leanne told the ABC a couple of months ago about that work.
What gets me out of bed every day is the fact that I know that there are good police officers out there who are providing me with a lot of the information that I need to eliminate racism in the police force. People who are brave and courageous, who bring that information to the table because they don't want to work in a system that's racist. I want those bad racist police officers to be the minority, and I want the good police officers to be able to be in a space where they can call out that bad behaviour and report it and know that we will do something about it.
Yeah, it reminds me, Mel, of what David Morrison said over a decade ago when the Defence Force was dealing with sexism and, abuse within itself, saying that, the standard that you walk past is the standard you accept. So, Leanne sounds like, she's trying to build a similar culture in the NT police force as well. And Mel, talking about the recommendation of NT police spending time in community, all this work that's being done around that. We spoke in the last episode about how strong Elizabeth Armitage's findings were. She really didn't hold back, basically finding that Zachary Rolfe was racist, finding the elements of racism with the NT police, all of these, really damning findings around, NT government, NT health, all of that. But then the recommendations all felt very achievable. They were all very matter of fact. They all seemed quite straightforward. Do you think they were written by Elizabeth Armitage knowing that they were going to be going to a Conservative CLP government that probably wasn't going to be that responsive?
Look, it's difficult to, get into the head of the coroner and, it's her job to be impartial and to write and make these findings and recommendations that, she feels will lead to genuine change. But yeah, like you said, and we talked about in the last episode, there was sort of a bit of a language shift, I think, from the findings, those hundreds of pages of findings to those 33 recommendations, which, were targeted predominantly at the police force, but also at various other government agencies for change. And a lot of the recommendations that she made seemed fairly straightforward, I suppose. Working with remote communities seems fairly obvious, right? And coming up with strategies to work with elders in these remote communities. And a lot of these recommendations that she made were also not necessarily things that we hadn't heard before. We've had the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, which made so many recommendations, which again sort of seemed in a lot of ways fairly obvious. So yeah, you might be onto something there, Stocky.
We've got a heap of questions that I want to get to in this ep, Mel, as we go through. So I'm going to start running through some of them with you now. First one is a question from Jennifer, who's been listening to the pod from the UK. She's got a question about the jury in Zachary Rolfe's murder trial, which is what we covered in episodes 2 and 3 of this series. And Jennifer asks, considering a jury is supposed to be representative of the community, were there any Aboriginal people on the jury? Is there an effort to actively include Aboriginal communities in jury selection?
This is a really, really big question in the Northern Territory in particular, and something that came up quite a lot throughout this process. We can't actually say for sure whether or not there were any Aboriginal people on the jury because of the legislation in Australia that protects the identities of jurors. The only information that we actually get from the court about the makeup of a jury is the gender split, how many men and women make up that number of 12. We heard from members of Kumanjayi Walker's family and community that there were no Yapa, no Warlpiri people that they were aware of that were on the jury, but we don't know for sure what the actual makeup was. There isn't sort of a specific push to try and include more Aboriginal people on Northern Territory juries.
Yeah. Thank you, Mel. And a wonderful question, Jennifer. So thank you for writing to the caseof at abc.net.au. Another one here, Mel, from Steph on the Gold Coast. Was Zachary Rolfe's police partner required to give evidence or be questioned? Surely their testimony would have been helpful.
Yeah, we did hear from people who had worked with Zachary Rolfe. We also heard from, his partner, Adam E. Burl, those who were there on the night of the shooting. Particularly throughout the Coronial inquest, we heard a lot of evidence from people who were there on the night. And, their evidence was helpful in terms of giving, a broader picture of what people saw and experienced on the night of the shooting.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. And Steph, wonderful question. So thank you for writing to the case of. Another one here, Mel, from Janet, who's listening to the pod in Madrid, in Spain. She writes, I'm wondering about why they left Kumanjayi Walker to die in the police station.
The court actually heard that police officers who were there in the police station in Yuendumu on the night did the best that they could to try and keep Kumanjayi Walker alive. They performed CPR, but they had very little, training for those sorts of things and very little equipment as well. We know Kumanjayi Walker was taken to the police station rather than the health centre because there were no nurses in Yuendumu at the time. Police didn't give mouth-to-mouth to Kumanjayi Walker on that night, but the court also heard that they didn't necessarily have to, and that may not have actually assisted in any way. Yuendumu was so far away from a hospital that it would have been very difficult to save Kumanjayi Walker's life that night, given the extent of his injuries.
Yep. Thank you, Mel. And thank you for the question as well, Janet. One here from Taya, Mel. Taya writes, as Zachary Rolfe was found not guilty, is he able to return to his role as a police officer, or is there some kind of regulation preventing that?
Zachary Rolfe did return to his role as a police officer after the trial, after he was acquitted of murder, manslaughter and engaging in a violent act causing death. He did return to work in Darwin. He wasn't in uniform or sort of out on the beat. He was working some kind of office job for several months before he then returned to leave when the inquest resumed or when the inquest started. He is no longer working as a Northern Territory police officer. Zachary Rolfe was dismissed from the force during the Coronial process, not for any disciplinary matters related to the night of the shooting, but for writing an open letter, which was published in a Northern Territory publication called the NT Independent, where he sort of criticised the Coronial process, the upper echelons of the Northern Territory Police Force, the investigation into the shooting. That was a breach of the Northern Territory Police's sort of media and public commentary guidelines. So he was dismissed from the force because of that. I should note he has flagged that he would appeal that decision to dismiss him, but he is now no longer working.
Yeah. Thank you, Mel. And thank you, Taya, for that question as well. Mel, as we get towards the end of this series, I want to take you to an email we got at the start of this. This is an email from Greg, and it's not so much a question, it's more of a statement. And he writes, "Hi there. I'm a dedicated listener. I love the podcast, I've cried, learnt and been fascinated and enthralled. I've looked and seen your next topic and immediately got teary. I'm hesitating to listen, so I'm emailing you instead. What happened in Yuendamu was felt so viscerally, not just in Yuendamu, but in every remote community in the NT. I'm a non-Indigenous linguist who has spent a career working in and around remote NT. The idea that remote homes were no longer safe, that police could enter an Aboriginal person's home and shoot a man dead, I believe something shifted in the collective psyche of remote Indigenous Territorians because of that day, and what was lost has never been recovered. I'm so scared to listen. 6 years is not long. So many hearts still hurt, not just for what happened, but for bearing witness to the power of the white man and his, and I use the male pronoun intentionally here, institutions. I work as an interpreter, often with police and the justice system. I see injustices and ignorance and misunderstandings and disadvantage all the time. Kumanjayi Walker's case still feels like an open wound. Keep up the great work. If I don't listen to this Kumanjayi Walker series, it's not you, it's me. Mel, is this still an open wound?
Yeah, absolutely it is, Stocky. And I think Greg's really hit the nail on the head there by saying that he believes something shifted in the collective psyche of remote Indigenous Territorians on that day. There's still so much pain and trauma. 6 years isn't that long to heal from the death of a loved one for anyone, let alone to heal from the death of a loved one in such a traumatic and public way. And Kumanjayi Walker isn't even the most recent death in custody in the Northern Territory. There's been several more since Kumanjayi Walker died, and in the lead up to the coroner's findings being handed down, there was the death of Kumanjayi White, another young Warlpiri man who died on the floor of a supermarket in Alice Springs during an attempted arrest by off-duty police officers in the centre of town. And I can't speak for Kumanjayi Walker or Kumanjayi White's family, but I went back to Alice Springs to cover Kumanjayi White's death as a reporter, and I was speaking to members of his family who I already knew from my work covering the death of Kumanjayi Walker. You know, we sat on the same grass out the front of the same police station, listening to the same people speaking, but speaking about the death of a different young man. And so it's so clear that there hasn't really been this chance to heal from the death of Kumanjayi Walker before family were then grieving the death of Kumanjayi White. And we don't have the details yet around the circumstances of Kumanjayi White's death. That's going to be another coronial inquest that the community is going to have to go through.
Thank you, Mel. And thank you, Greg, for writing to the case of. Mel, thank you so much as well for taking us through this whole story, for taking us to Yuendamu that night in 2019 and through the criminal trial and through the inquest. Really appreciate having you here on the case of to tell this story.
Thanks, Stocky.
And if you want to read some more, there's some wonderful books around at the moment as well. You know, during the production of this series, we read Stephen Schubert's book, Death in Yuendamu.
Yeah, and also Kate Wild's book, The Red House. Kate is also a former ABC journalist, and she held my hand throughout a lot of this case as well. So there's a lot of really incredible reporting and further reading that people can do on this case.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd encourage you, if you've learned something through this, if you want to read more, look around. There's plenty out there that you can check out to learn more about this story. And thank you for following through on the case of Kumanjayi Walker. The case of Kumanjayi Walker is produced by ABC Audio Studios and ABC News. It's reported by Melissa Mackay and presented by me, Stephen Stockwell. Our supervising producer is Greg Muller and our executive producer is Claire Rawlinson. Thank you to senior lawyer Jasmine Sims, to senior cultural advisor Miriam Korowa, and to editorial policies advisor Bridget Caldwell-Bright for their help making this series. This episode was produced on the land of the Gadigal and Wurundjeri people.